So, something exciting happened in July 2025. Something that wasn't hugely picked up by the media, even though it should have been. Climate change has become a legal issue. That's right. It's now a legal obligation of states to protect the environment and also to act against climate change. If they don't, they can be sued. Want to know more? Let's dive in. So, in July 2025, the International Court of Justice in The Hague issued a historic advisory opinion. States have now got a legal obligation to address climate change. This is following a case initiated by young law students from vulnerable Pacific islands. The goal was to establish that nations must protect the environment, limit global warming to 1.5%, and can be held accountable for climate harm under international law. The tension arose as many poorer countries, which were frustrated by the broken promises over many decades, sought justice and reparations, while wealthier nations like the UK and the US insisted that existing agreements were sufficient and no further obligations were needed. Because they would. The court ruled unanimously. Failing to act ambitiously on climate change now breaches international commitments. States can be held liable for the actions of companies they regulate, and developing countries can seek damages for climate impacts. The caveat, however, is that this is an opinion and that is not legally binding. It does carry a strong moral and legal weight and will empower future climate litigation. It does connect human rights to a healthier environment, and it does pave the way for potential reparations and stricter accountability globally. So how did this all come about? This case was brought about by a group of young law students from Pacific Islands. Many poorer countries had backed the case out of frustration, claiming that developed nations are failing to keep climate promises to tackle the growing problem. But the ICJ opinion now says that climate change was an urgent and existential problem, a threat really, and it cites decades of peer-reviewed research, even as skepticism has mounted in some quarters, led by the US. So what does the ruling actually say in some more detail? If countries do not develop the most ambitious possible plans to tackle climate change, this could constitute a breach of their promises in the Paris Agreement. Broader international law applies, which means that countries which are not signed up to the Paris Agreement or want to leave, like the US, are still required to protect the environment, including the climate system. The court ruled that the developing nations have a right to seek damages for the impact of climate change, for instance, destroyed buildings or infrastructure. As well as compensation, the court also ruled that governments were responsible for the climate impact of companies regulated in their countries. So, in terms of numbers, what does analysis say? How much it could amount to? So, in the journal Nature, it was estimated that between the year 2000 and 2019, there were about 2.8 trillion losses from climate change. $16 million per hour. It also said specifically that subsidies for the fossil fuel industry or approving new oil and gas licenses could be a breach of a country's obligation. What could be the impact of the advisory opinion? Well, an example is only a day after the World Court opinion, lawyers for the wind farm development distributed copies of it to the judges, which were on the final day of hearings on a case about whether planning permits for the wind farm should go forward or should prioritize pretty views of landscapes. NIMBYism, basically. So developing countries are also already exploring bringing new cases seeking compensation for historic contributions to climate change against richer, high-emitting nations. And legal teams have also started reviewing the impact of the ruling on litigation against the companies that produce fossil fuels, as well as the governments that regulate them. So this means that states could be held liable for the activities of private actors under their control, specifically mentioning licensing and subsidizing of fossil fuel production. How effective will this actually be? Well, if a country wants to bring a case back to the ICJ to make a ruling on compensation, then it can only do so against countries which have agreed to its jurisdiction, and that does not include the US or China. Also, reparations would be determined on a case-by-case basis, and amounts and the nature of reparations would depend on the circumstances. But again, even though advisory opinions are not binding, they do carry significant legal and moral authority and can help clarify and develop international law by defining states' legal obligations. So how did the ICJ come to this decision? What's the logic here? So, initially the ICJ responded to a request on two questions. What are the obligations of states under international law to ensure the protection of the environment? And two, what are the legal consequences for states under these obligations when they cause harm to the environment? And these were brought forward by the Pacific Island state of Vanuatu. The court used member state commitments on both environmental and human rights treaties to justify the decision. So that means that it checked that member states are parties to a variety of environmental treaties, like ozone layer treaties, biodiversity convention, Kyoto Protocol, Paris Agreement, and many more, which oblige them to protect the environment and the people worldwide and in a roundabout way, future generations. But also member states are party to numerous human rights treaties, and they are required to guarantee the enjoyment of rights that are sort of connected to climate change. That's because a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment is a precondition for the enjoyment of many human rights. So, you want to have human rights? You need a good and clean and healthy environment. But beyond this, the court also considered feedback from affected parties. So, in the process of those proceedings, it saw nations and international groups such as the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, OPEC, to offer their view on the case. Different groups had the opportunity to feed into the deliberations over several stages, including written submissions, oral statements, and then the court deliberated on those. And to put this into perspective with some numbers, the court received 91 written statements, a further 107 oral statements, which were all delivered at Den Haag in December 2024, and 65 responses to follow-up questions. So the judges had their work cut out. Generally, this was the highest level of participation in proceedings in the court's history. And some nations, including Barbados and Micronesia, appeared in front of the court for the first time ever. So huge ramifications on quite a wide range of things, really. Very, very, very important. And then what happened? In a unanimous decision on the 23rd of July 2025, the 15 judges of the ICJ concluded that the production and consumption of fossil fuels may constitute an international wrongful act attributable to that state. The opinion also says that limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees should be considered the primary temperature goal for nations, and to achieve it, they are obliged to make adequate contributions. Perhaps the main takeaway from the opinion is that the court recognized the principle of liability for climate harm as actionable under the existing rules. UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres calls it a victory for our planet, for climate justice, and for the power of young people. Personally, I can't wait to see the impact of this ruling in practice. Will we see an avalanche of lawsuits for GHG emitters? Maybe we'll see lawsuits against countries who aren't achieving their emission reduction targets. Will government decisions that endanger the environment lead to court? And what do you think? Will this bring a new age of climate litigation where polluters will get the living daylights sued out of them? Leave a comment with your thoughts. Let's talk about this. And thanks for watching.